Hi, all. Hope life in the quarantine is treating you well enough. Anyway, so just another short lecture or video. Just want to emphasize a few things about what's going on with the Zhuangzi. So we're moving from chapter 1 to chapter 17. And the reason why we're going in this order is that chapter 2, which we're moving on to next, is actually quite a difficult chapter. And chapter 17, in many ways, takes up the issues in chapter 2, but I think in a more accessible way than we find in chapter 2. Although there is more going on in chapter 2 than is going on in chapter 17. But again, chapter 17 is kind of a nice segue into chapter 2. So that's why we're reading the autumn floods at this point. Okay, so in chapter 1, right, wandering far and unfettered, again, the central question that's being addressed is how best to navigate this life, right, and how best to do it in a way that's free of anxiety and worry, given how uncertain and changeable everything is. Excuse me. So, in chapter 1, we had this ideal that gets talked about or is given to us on page 6, I believe, or am I messing it up here? So 5 to 6, that's right. So at the bottom of page 5, right? So, but suppose you were to chariot upon what is true both to heaven and to earth, riding atop the back and forth of the 6 atmospheric breaths, so that your wandering could nowhere be brought to a halt. Again, as I was suggesting through the repeatable quiz last week and through the lecture notes or the handout last week, I would suggest interpreting that line as meaning, what if you were able to depend on whatever arises, right, as opposed to depending on something else, or something, particularly something firm and fixed. Excuse me. So this idea, right, of not taking things as correct only if they go a particular way. So, for example, just to bring it back to the current situation with the coronavirus. So let's say that you had the principle that life is only worthwhile or worth living, or you can only have fun if you go out and socialize. Well, with the stay-at-home orders and people needing to practice social distancing, of course, that becomes problematic. And if you hold fixed to that principle of only being able to have things be worthwhile if you, say, go out and socialize, then you're going to be in trouble. And so one way of interpreting that passage, right, riding atop the 6 atmospheric breaths, what's true both to heaven and earth, is the idea that, well, whatever arises, you go with that, right? That's kind of the idea. And so in Autumn Floods, and in chapter 2, but for now, Autumn Floods, we are given reason for why we should attempt to do that, which is put out in chapter 1, wandering far and unfettered. Namely, right, we're given reasons and a kind of explanation of how to go about going with the flow, so to speak. I hate using that phrase, go with the flow, but with Taoism, in many ways, it's quite apt. Although it needs to be finessed in a number of ways. But so then, in chapter 17, Autumn Floods, we are, again, given a set of reasons, points to consider that are meant to shake us loose from holding to any kind of absolute value or judgment or principle about how things should go, about what's good, what's bad, etc., etc. This will all become clearer when you look at the handout on D2L and when you read the chapter. And also when you work on the discussion board assignment this week. So we're not going to do a quiz this week. I originally planned on doing a quiz on top of the discussion board assignment. I'm not going to do that this time. There's enough going on with just the discussion board assignment. So if you put in the time going back and forth between the handout, the discussion board assignment, and the text, I think it'll come a long way in further developing your understanding of what's going on in the Zhuangzi. I do want to point out a couple of things, or at least one thing at this point. So again, that line from chapter 1 on page 5, right? So, but suppose you were to chariot upon what is true, both to heaven and earth. Now, let's be careful, right? So the heaven here is not the Christian heaven, right? So the ancient classical Chinese are not Christians. They're not in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So really, what's meant by heaven and earth here is just all of the natural world, but above and below. And so that's another term that would be useful. Heaven, another term that would be useful to look up in the glossary. And so I really do want to encourage y'all to take advantage of the glossary, look up the terms that come up in the text. Otherwise, y'all, the main thing is just email me if you have questions or post questions on the Ask Anything discussion board for this week on D2L. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So, yeah, y'all, hang in there. We can get through this. Yeah, just take a deep breath and be well, y'all. Okay, bye.